You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 257 of the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, Ben Eagle. My guest today is Patrick Holden, who will be known to many of you as a true pioneer of sustainable agriculture. Patrick farms with his wife Becky in West Wales, producing a raw milk cheddar known as Hafod from the milk of Ayrshire cows. Patrick arrived on the farm with a few friends in the 1970s, and it is now the longest established organic dairy farm in Wales. He studied biodynamic agriculture at Emerson College and was the founding chairman of British Organic Farmers in 1982 before joining the Soil Association in 1995. Patrick led the Soil Association until 2010, and in that time played a leading role in developing the organic standards and market. Between 1995 and 2010, annual sales of organic produce in Britain rose from 50 million to 2 billion. In 2011, he founded the Sustainable Food Trust, which has a mission to work to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable food and farming systems. He received a CBE for services to organic farming in 2005 and is patron of the UK Biodynamic Agriculture Association. He became an Ashoka Fellow in 2016. If you don't know what that is, look it up. It's a really fascinating organisation in itself. And he was awarded an honorary doctorate for his international work in sustainable agriculture by the University of Wales, Trinity St David in 2022. Patrick, it's an absolute honour to have you on the show. Welcome to Meet the Farmers.
Well, blimey, what a mouthful.
There's a lot there.
Let's call me number 257.
We'll go for that if you'd like.
Well, when we first got here in the 70s, there was a local farmer, near neighbour called Dilwyn Phillips, and he was a bit older than us. And I remember going to see him. God knows what everyone thought we were like when we arrived. But anyway, we're leaning over the gate and he said, we're all brothers and sisters on the land, in a very sort of quiet, gentle way. And I thought that sums up how we should regard all our fellow farmers.
I like that. We will we'll go on to talk about some of your story and your thoughts of your journey along the way. But I want to start actually with quite a big question, but I think it's an important one as well. I mean, you've worked in the broad food and farming sector with various sort of hats on and various experiences for over 50 years now. So in terms of the changes, both in terms of changes that you've seen in the land through that and land practices, but also ways of thinking and the ways that we talk about food and farming. I'd just be interested in some reflections on you on those changes over that time.
Well, I mean, thinking back to the time when I first got interested in farming, which was kind of 1971 in my own right. And then when we arrived here, there was a very buoyant atmosphere around at that time because we joined we hadn't actually, I think we voted to join the European Union in 1975, but farmers were still benefiting before that from post-war subsidies. And so it was profitable, or at least you could make a go of it, farming on quite a small scale. And so there was a buoyancy and a confidence, I think, in the farming community, and also a belief that growing two blades of grass where one grew before, helped by a combination of fertilizers and then sprays and also subsidies, was a good thing. And a lot of farmers were gearing up and growing more and more, whatever it was they were growing, and producing more and more milk. And it all felt very positive. Interestingly enough, when we came here in 1973, there were, I think, around 3,000 dairy farmers supplying the local creamery in Wellenbach, which is about 8 miles from where I am now.
Wow.
And during the last 51 years since we arrived, that number has shrunk. I don't actually know what the number of dairy farmers left in Ceredigion is. That's the county where we are. But it's a tiny fraction, and we're still losing them. And our dairy herd of 85 currently Ayrshire cows, mainly Ayrshire cows, is really unusual because we've survived with less than 100 cows. And most dairy farmers, they're a statistic because they just had to get out. So the answer is there's been a massive change in the economic climate because that's been caused in part, I guess, by the very success of intensification. And then when the Milk Marketing Board was abolished, initially that was even better for farmers, but quite quickly it became worse because there was overproduction of milk, quotas went, and the price came down, and that's been happening ever since. So the economic climate has got progressive, with bumps and dips and stuff, has got progressively worse the whole time we've been farming here. And I would say the attitude amongst the farming community of confidence, which was definitely prevalent at that time, has now changed. I think there's a lot of anxiety, confusion about which way ahead, and real economic challenge. So a huge difference. I mean, there's lots of nuances to that. We could talk about the regen movement and what their attitude is and what happened to the organic movement and all sorts of other things, but maybe they'll come up.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, just on that point that you've survived with your 85 Ayrshire's when others haven't, why do you think that is? What is it that you've been doing?
Well, we initially, I actually wrote I think what might have been the world's first draft of the organic dairy standards, because there weren't any livestock standards. That's interesting to reflect that organic livestock it didn't exist. The concept didn't even exist. And then the Soil Association Livestock Standards Committee, I was a member, and they said, well, you better write the first draft because you're a dairy farmer. So that happened. So the first bit of survival was we got a better price because we started to realize quite early on in our time here that even at the relatively buoyant prices that we were getting from the Milk Marketing Board, and then from the co-ops after the Milk Marketing Board was dismembered, it wasn't really enough to cover our costs and make a profit. So we had this idea, write down what we were doing. Literally, I did that for world's first draft of the Organic Dairy Standards, and then tell our story to the consumer who would pay an extra premium. So that happened shortly after we got certified. We got certified as soon as there were organic dairy standards. That was in 1985. And then in the year before that, I'd been on with Peter Seger, my friend Peter Seger, on Your Farm program, which at that time was presented by a man called Tony Parkin, who was also agricultural editor of the Archers. And weirdly enough, the chairman of the Welsh Development Agency was listening to that On Your Farm program, or rather, more accurately, I think his wife was. And they were obviously lying in bed. It was a Sunday morning. And she prodded him and said, oh, you ought to go and see those people. They sound interesting. So the chairman of the Welsh Development Agency came onto the farm in his Porsche a couple of days later. And he said, we'll fund you to set up a cooperative to produce cheese and add value to your milk. So the first bit of the story, that's a very long-winded way of saying we added value to the milk by selling it to a cheesemaker. The cheesemaker was Dougal Campbell, who was already making a raw milk cheddar, which the recipe for which has influenced our cheese. And we set up a unit in the Lambton Industrial Estate, and about, I think, 5 or 6 organic dairy farmers, all from West Wales, supplied milk to that operation. We could talk for an hour about that, but I won't. Then we got an organic premium because all the organic co-ops were set up, Omsco, Callan Wen in Wales. And then, of course, others came along, like now Arla are paying an organic price and lots of other people are as well. So we got extra money for our milk to sell to other people who were adding value to it. And then after 2007, we started making cheese ourselves. And that, of course, made a better margin because if you take the current price of milk, let's say 50 pence if you're very lucky, organic milk, you can triple the value of that milk by turning it into cheese. So short answer, summary, we added value to our milk, first of all, for an organic premium, then it's cheese. And then we also, in parallel with that, grew vegetables, starting very small in 1979, but then growing until we were quite a major supplier of carrots to the UK supermarkets until 2006, when that all came to an end because the supermarkets closed all their pack houses in the west of Britain and moved them to the east, and we couldn't make that work. So that was another bit of added income, quite a lot actually at the peak. But then since 1994, I think it was, the year before I became director of the Soil Association, I've had a day job, a paid day job. And that obviously has contributed to what otherwise might have been a situation we wouldn't have survived. So we're not a statistic because we make cheese and I've got a day job.
There are all sorts of offshoot questions that I have off that, but I'm going to stick with the story for now. And actually, I want to go back to the early years of your life, really, because I'm interested in where those seeds were sown in terms of your own interest in food and farming. But tell me about your life growing up and how that interest developed.
Well, I grew up in London. My dad was a child psychiatrist. He trained as a doctor before that, so we moved around a lot on the edge of London. And one of those training years was spent in a village called Hexton in Hertfordshire, where my dad was a house officer at Luton General Hospital. And we were living in a vicarage, an ex-vicarage, right next to the church. And it was the most amazing childhood year of my life because the estate around Hexton, still owned by the same family, I believe, was at that time, this is 1956, 57, being farmed really in a pre-intensive way. So there was still a rotation. The crops were going largely without any nitrogen fertilizer, no pesticides. And the result was there was an incredible abundance of wildlife which coexisted with food production. And most people now aren't old enough to remember that, or even if they are old enough, they wouldn't have been on a farm at that time. But I was. So I spent the year collecting birds' eggs and making rather a good collection, which was legal then, and also butterflies, chloroforming them. Again, I made no difference whatsoever to the bird or butterfly populations because they were so abundant. And that wildlife was very much coexisting with the farming system. So that was a huge influence on me. But then those influences collected in other ways. We had a lot of childhood holidays in Devon, Cornwall, and then Hebridean Islands, particularly Isle of Skye, where my dad eventually bought a small ruined croft house in 66. So I had massive influences of nature. And I used to keep lots of animals in our London gardens and dig ponds. So I had a really strong interest in livestock and amphibians. And those things collected. And then my dad was posted out to California, to the San Francisco Bay Area, to Palo Alto, Stanford University in 1970-71. I went out there. I spent some time in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that was a huge influence on me. So all those influences collected. And when I came back from California in the summer of 71, it already had kind of crystallized in me that I wanted to set up a rural community and get back to the land.
Okay, that's interesting because I read about your time in San Francisco, and I was wondering before you said that whether you'd gone out there on your own back, as it were, or whether there was a family link. So that's interesting. That was part of that. When you returned to the UK, because I mean, you did a biodynamic course at Emerson College. What happened first? So did the interest in the Back to the Land movement become first, and then that sparked the route to go to Emerson and everything else, or did you go to Emerson first and then that came as a result?
I already was aware of the commune movement. That was prevalent in America and the UK. There was a magazine called Communes, and of course we used to subscribe to it. And part of the sort of commune idea was to get back to the land and live a self-sufficient lifestyle. There's a book called Self-Sufficiency by John Seymour, which was widely read. It was probably a bestseller even in those days. And it was all about living self-sufficiently off the land. So we thought, well, part of getting back to the land is farming. And of course, it would be farming organically, although that word wasn't what it was used then, but it wasn't widely used. And so we thought, well, better learn something about farming. So I got a job when I got back on a quite intensive dairy farm just outside Bishop's Waltham in Hampshire, where I spent a year learning a huge amount about dairy farming. But then I thought I'd better study something. And at that time, there weren't really many organic or sustainable agriculture courses out there. But Emerson College had a 1-year foundation course in biodynamic agriculture with a chap called Professor Herbert Kupf, a German guy, very nice man, came to this farm actually years later with his students. And so I did that. It was learning in the morning and practice in the afternoon. And I spent the afternoons on a farm just outside East Grinstead, Buss's farm, run by Jimmy and Pauline Anderson. Lovely people, both no longer with us. But their family was a huge influence on me because they were interested in culture as well as food production. So those were that was the training. And then in June 1973, 6 of us, who were mostly sort of a friendship network I built when I was at school before I went to California. Luckily, the family of 2 of the communards were wealthy. And so their parents bought us this very rundown 135-acre farm in West Wales, which where I am today. So that was how we got back to the land.
That's where that started. Just pausing here, listeners, to say that, it is 100 years since China's lectures in biodynamics. And if you're interested, we have 2 episodes coming up later this year looking at the history and future of biodynamics.
Are you a farmer or grower based in the UK? Do you have a story to tell, but you're not quite sure how to tell it? Then sign up to Just Farmers. We give farmers and growers the confidence to tell their stories with pride through fully funded media education workshops aimed at boosting your confidence and communication skills. Our goal is to build a more open and constructive relationship between farmers and the consumer via the media. Being a part of Just Farmers gives you the chance to meet other farmers and growers that you would never normally meet, build strong bonds of friendship, and be a part of a network of farmers creating positive change in UK farming. If you think this sounds like something you'd like to do, then sign up to Just Farmers at www.justfarmers.org.
So you came to the farm, you came to West Wales. This community ultimately dispersed, as you said, and you took the farm on yourself. But take me through that early time of establishing the farm. You said it was run down. What did you have to do on the ground in terms of bringing it back to life, I suppose?
Well, we decided we would be dairy farmers right from the start, probably because I'd had experience on a dairy farm in Hampshire, and I loved dairy cows. My mum, one of my childhood influences I didn't mention was that my mum took me to one of those traditional cow sheds in a small dairy farm just outside Epping in Essex, where my dad was also part of his training. And I remember loving the smell and the atmosphere and thinking I'd like to do that. So I think it's very interesting to reflect on how powerful childhood impressions are and how much they can plant seeds of interest, which then germinate later in life. That was definitely it for me. So we decided to establish a dairy herd. We were going to get a herd of black and white animals because everybody did and still does. And then I met this guy who was actually part of another commune just up the road from here, who already had bought a herd of dairy cows. And this guy said to me, "Have you ever thought about Ayrshires?" And I said, "No, why would I think about that?" And he said, "Well, they're very thrifty. They got good feet, well-attached udders. They milk well off forage, and they've got nice milk." And later on, when we started making cheese, I didn't realize the significance of that at the time. Ayrshires have a particularly good golden ratio between the butterfat and the protein and actually the lactose in their milk, and they have small fat particles. all of which are very good for cheese making. So we bought a dairy herd. I wrote to the secretary of the Ayrshire Society, as one did, writing in these days. It was a letter. And I said, we want to buy some Ayrshires. What would you advise? And he said, I remember this letter. It's rather nice. He said, well, you could go to an auction, in which case this phrase, your eye is your merchant. Isn't that a lovely phrase? So you can look at, a herd of dairy cows being dispersed, and you have to pick the best ones with your eye. Well, we didn't have any experience. So he said, you're better off just buying from known breeders. So that's what we did. We bought 22 cows from Scotland and 8 from Sussex. And that was the foundation dairy herd, the descendants of which are, still with us today. And that's what we did. We started milking in a really decrepit milking parlour. It was an abreast, but it wasn't even a step up, and it was falling apart. And we had a milking rota. We named the cows A to Z, April to Zulu. They all had a name of the alphabet. And we were obsessed with, we started milking. It was churns then, galvanized iron, and then they became aluminium. That was a huge upgrade between 1973 and 76 when churns went and we had a tanker for the first time. Conversations were all about, every morning at breakfast, how the cows had milked and all that sort of thing. We just learnt as we went along, and looking back, it was an amazing time. I mean, oh my God, it was so brilliant. Yeah. Even though weren't there stresses and strains? Yes. Was it difficult? Yes, because the first winter, it never stopped raining, and literally there was water running through the house, and there were definitely difficulties with some of the communards, but it was brilliant. So I haven't lost my interest in community farming at all. But it did actually gradually fall apart. And in the end, a couple of years later, I was left with my first wife, Lou, and our kids, and Stuart and Stephanie, whose family had bought the farm, left. And their parents said, well, if you're not there, no reason to own the farm anymore. So they put the farm on the market. Luckily, at the time, there was a brother of an Emerson student who I'd done the agriculture course with, doing voluntary work, woofing on the farm. He was called Nick Rebeck. And he said, look, I've inherited some money from my grandfather. Why don't I buy the farm and give you a tenancy, because I want to make films in London. So he went to London, made films, and we had a tenancy for the next 15 years. This is me and Lou, my wife. And during that time, we did all sorts of things. We grew wheat. We had a mill which we milled the wheat into flour, the spring wheat, and we sold it in the Aberystwyth Whole Food Shop. And then we started growing carrots in 1979 and started them to London. So we did lots of different things, and they were all, back to your earlier question, they were all kind of part of the economic survival tactics. But it was more than that. We wanted to have a diverse range of enterprises, and that was all part of the dream.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned the wheat and the carrots, because I was fortunate enough to attend an event at Patrick's a few weeks ago now, and one of the big things that I took away from there, from several conversations, was this shift in perception of farming in the West, in terms of there's this broad perception of it being a land of grass, but actually a big thing that I took away from, historically as well as present capacity, is the ability to grow that diversity of crops and animals actually on the land.
That's so right. You would have heard this because you were here. This guy, Owen Shears, who is a singer and a storyteller, he, and proper Welsh, Welsh-speaking, lovely man, came to our gathering, and he told the story about the black oats, which, as he said, were grown widely in Wales until the 60s. And after then, all these modern varieties started coming in. Of course, Aberystwyth was partly responsible for that. They've got a plant breeding station there, and they developed some of these varieties of so-called improved oats. And once that happened, and also I think because of the royalties and all the sort of legal framework around growing grain and sowing it, quite quickly, these indigenous oats, which he said had been grown, black oats they're called, Kirchdi, grown since the Ice Age, wow, just quickly disappeared. And when Owen started looking for them 5 years ago or so, he thought they'd gone extinct, the black oats. And then luckily, by a series of coincidences, he found a small Welsh farmer a bit south of here who was growing them for his chickens. And we were presented with a couple of sweet jars of these black oats 4 years ago, and we bred them up. And this year, we've got around 3.5 to 4 acres. And I was just looking at them the other day. It's unbelievable how well they've done. They look more vigorous than the oats and peas that we've grown from purchased seed. And we've now got the largest area of black oats in Wales. And next year, we're thinking that we'll just grow nothing but black oats because it's just, why not? There would have been quite a mixed farming economy in West Wales. And most farmers grew a patch of what they used to call green crop, which were basically their vegetables. And when we came in 73, this was still going on. And there was a guy called Tommy Carrots. This is before we grew carrots. He used to come and sell us carrots, because he grew a patch of carrots every year. And funnily enough, this year, because we've got back into carrots after 18 years not growing them because of the supermarket making it impossible, we're now growing just over an acre of carrots for Carmarthenshire schools. And interestingly enough, we've got everything right this year and the crop looks fantastic. But to your point, the soils of West Wales are quite capable of growing arable crops. And really what we need to go forward towards is a mixed farming system, not just grass fertilized with nitrogen. And farmers in West Wales growing beef or lamb or milk, taken away from, weirdly, what companies called off-takers. I don't know if you've heard that phrase.
No.
In the food industry, people don't talk about buying crops. They talk about off-takers, meaning they just take the crop off the farmer. And that's become the story of our food today. Farmers all over the world, really, they grow food. They may not eat it themselves. They probably don't these days. Off-takers take it up to some vast processing or packing operation, turn it into what Michael Pollan calls food-like substances, which we now know are ultra-processed and are damaging our health. And we have the connection between ourselves and our food has been completely severed. And I think the tide is turning now. We need to change all that and regain a proper relationship with the food we eat.
In your view, how much of that shift was because of genuine changes in the market or shifts in the market? And how much was it down to mindset itself? So more on the part of the producer side. So almost an acceptance of that changing situation.
That's such a profound question. And the honest answer, I don't really know. I think it's a bit like, you put frogs in a pail of water, then apparently, I haven't done this, if you gradually warm it up, they don't know what's going on, and then eventually they die. I think we were just swept along. All of us. We just thought it was progress, intensification. It's like in the livestock world, get big, intensify, or get out is the unsaid mantra. If you read the dairy farming press, which of course I do, that's the kind of vibe of it, get even more potent semen, which enables your Holstein Friesian cows to produce 14,000 litres of milk a year, never go outside. And why don't you, if you've got 500 cows, why not go for 700 or 1,000 or 2,000? Keep them inside. And that's progress. And I think that attitude has become embedded in the farmer's psyche. And then because the food companies and retailers are themselves in an impossible situation, really. You might think it's funny for me to show compassion towards them, but if you think about it, if you're running a supermarket or a big food company, enough I've met some of these people, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about shareholder return. They're thinking about their competition, because if you're Sainsbury's, you're worried about Lidl, etc., and Aldi, and their customers who seem to be obsessed with cheap food. So they are trapped between these rocks and hard places to follow the path of the price of food down. And the best way to do that is to buy very cheap commodities, process them into a range of disgusting products, which are probably going to make you sick. But there's more of a margin in that than there is in selling fresh food. So I think it's just everyone's been on this treadmill. As we speak, I'm just about to go to the DEFRA reception in London. This is the summer drinks for the new ministerial team.
Okay.
And I'm going to meet the new Secretary of State, well, if I can catch his eye, as it were, and to hang out with all the people who are going to also try to be catching his eye or their eyes. And I don't think that what I've just been saying to you is in their mindset at all. I mean, I know they're definitely thinking, what's the future? And they might have in the back of their mind, oh, maybe agriculture could get greener because, you know, the elms stuff and all this. But I don't think they've realised how comprehensively things have gone wrong.
Meet the Farmers is brought to you by RuralPod Media, the only podcast production agency to specialise in the rural sector. We're on a mission to make rural stories mainstream and help businesses, organisations and communities like you tell your story through podcasting. Podcasting is a fantastic way of connecting with your audience, whoever that might be, getting your message out there and networking with leaders in your niche. RuralPod Media can help you by launching your new podcast or helping you with the technical side. We also provide podcast training and an audit service if you already have a podcast, you're not sure where to take it to next. For more information or to book a call, visit ruralpodmedia.co.uk. That's ruralpodmedia.co.uk. Let's shift to the organic story. And I mean, you have a deep personal history with this. I mean, stretching back to the 80s in terms of you're the founding chair of British Organic Farmers. You joined the Soil Association in 95. I'm particularly interested, I mean, earlier in this interview, you were talking about awareness, because I mean the organic movement obviously stretches way back to Eve Balfour and the early days of Albert Howard's sort of influence. So it has a deep heritage. But from what you've been saying so far, and I'm interested in the perception of organic and general awareness. From what I'm reading, it took decades to actually build traction in terms of broader awareness.
Yeah, it is interesting to reflect back on the extraordinary insights that those early founders of the organic movement, as it's become known, had. I mean, Albert Howard's book, An Agricultural Testament, I don't think there's ever been a better book written about agriculture. It's so brilliant, comprehensive, far-reaching, visionary, and it's all there. You know, all the big ideas are in his book. And then Eve Balfour read that book when it was published in 1940, and that's what inspired her to found the Soil Association. And there were others as well. Obviously, Rudolf Steiner, you've mentioned, Lord Northbourne, who was allegedly the first person to coin the word organic farming. There were a whole bunch of brilliant pioneers.
Brent Sykes.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got all these books, and all the big ideas were there and all the good practices were there. Weirdly enough, many of these people are establishment figures. I mean, Eve Balfour herself was the niece of Prime Minister Balfour, but they were thought of being eccentric and weird and rebels, and actually kind of largely ignored and sidelined, even though they were establishment people. And it wasn't until the second wave of the organic movement came along, and that was people like me, not just me. There were maybe 100 of us that got clubbed together and started organising conferences at Cirencester, the first of which was in 1980, where we became a kind of organised orthodoxy challenging group. And weirdly enough, even though I totally revere Eve Balfour and Howard and everyone else like that, we got into trouble. We were regarded as the Young Turks. And there was a bit of a coup on the Soil Association Council, where the people who had gathered around Lady Eve saw it as a kind of church which was, you know, embedded in their philosophy, their shared philosophy. But I think they thought that people like us who said, well, look, we're not going to survive unless we sell our food and make a commercial market out of it. I think they felt deeply threatened by that. And you can understand why, because we were a bit precocious and young. We thought we were right and all those sort of things. And it must have been extraordinarily irritating for them. And Eve herself, I knew Eve because she was still the honorary president of the Soil Association. And before I started working for the Soil Association, I was a council member for quite a number of years. So I had an unpaid relationship with the Soil Association from, I think it was 1982 until 95. And it was a very challenging and complicated time. And people have even written dissertations about it, whether the new organic movement was connected in its philosophy and its relationships with the founders. And I can say, because I was there, that it definitely was. I mean, I think those people were really amazing, and it was necessary for this shift between the early people who set the whole thing up, and then the next wave, of which I was one, needed to take things into the world a bit more. And of course, all organizations and movements go through these changes. There'll be more ahead.
Just turning to standards, but also the market itself. The organic market has inevitably seen growth, but it's still very much a niche within the market. So do you see, the big question here, but it's to do with relevance within the market. Does organics need to innovate still, or is it fully fit for purpose as it is?
Well, again, people are studying this. There's Sophie Aplin-Gregory,
yeah, of course,
who's a Nuffield scholar on exactly that question, the future of organic. And it's a very important and topical and relevant question. How can I answer it briefly? I think that those of us who wrote the earlier drafts of the organic standards were doing that because we believed in principles of sustainable agriculture, all of which were set out in the books of those people we mentioned. And we wanted to write a prescription for their application and labeling so that people who wanted to buy food from that system of farming based on those core principles could do so and pay extra. So it was a kind of economic survival strategy, if you see what I mean. We wanted to sell our milk or carrots or whatever they were at a, quote, premium, but we didn't really see it like that. We saw it, we wanted, although I couldn't have said this then, we wanted to cover the extra costs of production. Okay. And what we also didn't realize then was we were living in a world where the polluter didn't pay, and the public benefits of truly sustainable agriculture were not reflected in the price that we were getting for our food. So economists these days would call those externalities. The former negative externalities, that's, water, the nitrogen getting into water and pesticides, greenhouse gas emissions from all the things that we use on farms, damage to social capital, people losing their jobs, etc., etc. Those are negative externalities, but the positive externalities could be building soil organic matter, or more nutritious food, or stronger skill set in farming and more people employed. So we were up against these twin headwinds of uncosted negative and positive externalities, none of which we understood at all. And remember that at that time, climate change wasn't even on the agenda at all either.
Yeah.
So we thought, well, the best way to counter those is to set up a separate market. It was that simple. It wasn't weird. It wasn't us trying to build a brand, as everybody calls it these days. It was just trying to make a living in a difficult world where the polluter didn't pay and, the good stuff didn't get rewarded. And now, if you look at what's happened, 40-something years later, yes, the organic market has grown, but it's plateaued for perfectly good reasons, in my view. Two good reasons, there are probably more. One is that until you make the polluter pay and reward farmers who build carbon and all the other things we're doing, it's very difficult to persuade people to pay such a large premium for food which is, better. So that's part of the reason why it hasn't grown, economic. And the second reason is that I'm not sure how many people fully understand what I've just said. That, in other words, if you do farm in the way that we've now farmed for 51 years, the result is more soil organic matter, better food, more nutritious food, more employment, much more biodiversity. I don't think those things are fully understood. And they're definitely not understood in Westminster, where I shall be going this evening. I don't think this is on their radar screen, and yet it should be. And so what to do? So I think your question was, what's the future for organic?
Yeah.
Well, there's the regen movement, which is in the ascendant. which is fantastic in the sense that thousands and thousands of conventional arable farmers and some livestock farmers too are realizing that it's possible to farm in a more nature-friendly way. And they're switching to methods which are hopefully going to build soil, hopefully increase biodiversity and reduce their costs, and everyone wins. So I think that's a fantastic thing. There are a lot of people in the organic movement who are a little bit upset about this because they're thinking, well, hang on a minute, the pennies dropped that, what we've been doing isn't right, and we can join this, born again Christian movement called Regen. And it's very easy. You just stop using this and use a bit less of the other, and a couple of years of pain, and then it's all better. And I think there are some people in the organic movement who feel a bit miffed about it, understandably, because we've been doing these things all these years, and suddenly these people come along. But I think we have to not have that attitude. I think it's really important. We should welcome the Regen movement and ask questions about which practices and systems of farming best deliver the climate, nature, and social benefits that we all need from our future food and farming systems. That's the way to navigate this transition. What will be the relationship between the organic and the regenerative movement? That's a key question. I think we should just talk to each other. But one of the projects that we're working on in the Sustainable Food Trust, I think might help to reconcile this division at worst between the organic and the regen people, which is that if we all measure the impacts of our different farming systems using a common framework, looking at the climate, nature and social impacts of all the systems, including our own here, then we will find out which systems best deliver the public goods which we all want to see coming from agriculture. So that is my reconciling solution, or our reconciling solution. And the way that we can make that work, for instance, would be to have pilots where we reward farmers for measuring their impacts using a common framework over perhaps 5 years. And if I was part of that trial, I would love to know whether the farming practices we are using here do benefit soil carbon, biodiversity, and, say, the nutritional density of our food, because we have not been measuring. That's the point, isn't it? Nobody's been measuring, or if we have been, it's all with lots of different frameworks. So we must have, in my view, a globally harmonized way of measuring the impacts of different farming systems. Then we will gather baseline information about what systems work and what systems don't work. Some will work, I'm sure, but others will work less well. We need to know the difference.
And that is a perfect link to talking about the Sustainable Food Trust, which is known for the Global Farm Metric alongside other projects. You founded the SFT in 2011, having stepped away from the Soil Association. Why?
Why did I found it?
Why did you found it?
I founded it because my exit from the Soil Association was complex. Let's just say that. Yeah. And I did make the decision to leave the Soil Association, but it wasn't without difficulty. And some of the difficulties relate to what we've just been discussing, by which I mean that there was a difference of perspective between me and some of the other people in the Soil Association at the time. So I felt that the Soil Association's main role was to build an informed body of public opinion about the relationship between agricultural practice and societal health. And so for me, all the issues which arose when I was director, including foot and mouth disease, genetic engineering, transition towns, misuse of antibiotics, to me, they were the issues we needed to highlight and campaign on, because the public needed to have a deep understanding of the impact of different farming systems and inputs and practices on health. But I think there were a number of people within the Soil Association who saw the organic brand as the thing which we just needed to promote. And in 2008, there was a recession. All the banks collapsed, and it was that powerful moment where the economy really went into a decline. And that had an effect on the organic market. And the Soil Association was quite large at that time. And it was just complex. And in the end, I thought, why don't I step out onto a new stage? And I was helped in doing that by some wonderful people who said, look, you've developed a network of international contacts. It would be good if you set up a new organization which was more inclusive, worked on a broader stage, not just organic farmers, but all farmers who wanted to move in a more sustainable direction. And that was the Sustainable Food Trust. So I think it was, you could look back on things and you could say, oh, everything happens for a reason. Right. I think I do believe that sometimes the things that happen can be quite painful, but then very often those points of pain can also be points of growth. And I think my departure from the Soil Association and the next chapter that was built out of that was positive for me and hopefully positive for my work in the world.
And skip ahead 13, 14 years to today, in terms of the priorities of the Sustainable Food Trust, what are those?
I think the most important tasks at the moment is to influence people who are in leadership positions. And by very good fortune, I've ended up being in a position to be able to do that, because in 2020, the then Prince of Wales, now King Charles, set up an initiative called the Sustainable Markets Initiative, SMI, at Davos. And his reason for doing that was that he believed, and I think he was right, that we will only address the challenges of climate change and the nature crisis and the health crisis, you could argue, in the time available if we involve the largest businesses in the world at CEO level, because although they and we have created the problem, it's of course because of their scale and their power to influence things and their sheer economic might. They're the ones that, if they get it, their leadership is going to help us all out of the mess that we are in. So to take the SMI forward, he set up, or there were set up, a number of task forces, one for each business sector. And we are talking about everything from mining to aviation to plastics to everything, banking, finance, and of course, agri-business, as it's called. So I'm on that task force, but I also head up another one on sustainability measurement, focusing on the global farm metric. And because I'm also on the advisory council as a CEO who's leading a task force, I'm on the advisory council. It's been my good fortune to make the acquaintance of some of the other leading CEOs. So if you told me 5 years ago you'll end up knowing and literally be on good personal terms with some of the most powerful CEOs in the world, I would have said that will never happen.
Okay.
It actually has happened. So now I've got this interesting network of people. And what is clear about them all is that they're good people, highly intelligent, well-meaning, got very demanding jobs, but not many of them know very much about agriculture. And yet, if you think about it, there isn't an industry in the world that doesn't depend in some way on the land. Even if you're in aviation or something with an enormous carbon footprint, there's a thing called Scope 3 emissions, which is basically the climate change emissions, which are not yours as a company. Say if you're Tesco, that would be heating the offices and the distribution and stuff like that. But your Scope 3 emissions are the emissions from your supply chain. And that would, in the case of any food company, include farmers. But if you can't deal with your Scope 3 emissions by getting your farms to farm in a more regenerative way, which of course some of them can, but you're never going to do that if you're an aviation company, you might want to buy carbon offsets, which is contentious, of course, but basically you can offset your emissions by paying money for somebody else who can build soil carbon or sequester carbon in some other way. And so the point I'm making is that nobody's disconnected from agriculture. And because of that, and also because of a cross-task force initiative that I've been involved in establishing, financing the agricultural transition, it's led to some amazing new collaborations between banks, insurance companies, food companies and retailers, obviously, utility companies and farmers, because the proposition is that if you want to transition to a more regenerative farming system, as things stand today, you'll probably make less money than if you carry on farming extractively. So until and unless we create an economic climate which is more favorable for regenerative and organic farming than the other sort, we're not going to get the change we need. So financing the agricultural transitions become a real focus of my recent work with the SMI.
You're also launching a pilot program of what are called beacon farms. This is early days for this, but I think this is a really interesting project. What's the idea behind this?
Nearly everyone is completely disconnected from the story behind their food because they never go onto farms and they really don't know very much, which is kind of the problem that the Soil Association still is in, that people don't know what organic farming is. So what's the antidote to that? I think the answer is develop a network of farms which combine good practice, facilities for visitors, and good storytelling. And this idea of creating a global network of beacon farms, which act as educational stages for visitors, I think has potency, because you could say, well, that's a very long-winded way of mobilizing public opinion. It definitely is, but on the other hand, it's, one person at a time, isn't it? If you can get a school child, as I was when I grew up in London, to visit a dairy farm, you have a lifelong influence on them. So I think we have to aim to get millions of people onto farms, have a really positive experience, and that will be the power that eventually gets to Sir Keir Starmer's attention, because at that point, he'll realize there's votes in this. If you were to ask him today whether he thinks there are many votes that will get Labour re-elected for a second term in the food and farming agenda, I think he'll say probably not. He might have heard of ultra-processed food and the wonderful work that Chris Van Tullochen is doing. I doubt if he thinks it's an electoral issue. We've got to prove him wrong. And the other thing, just to say, because with the three legs to the SFT's work, the other bit is hopefully producing useful reports which influence people's thinking. So a couple of those are the hidden costs of UK food, which try to do an economic analysis of how distorted current food prices are. And the headline is that if you buy a pound's worth of food in a supermarket, that's only half its real cost. And it's probably only a third of its real cost because the damage to the climate, nature, and societal health is not costed in. We also produced a report, which you'll know about, Feeding Britain from the Ground Up, which is a modelling exercise, notionally transitioning the whole of UK agriculture to regenerative practices as defined, and then looking at the impact on food output and national diets. So we hope that our reports also are influential. That's the kind of in the middle bit.
Oh gosh, I mean, there are certain time is flying in this interview in the usual way, and there are so many areas that I'd like to look at. But I think I'm going to draw this towards regenerative agriculture, because I think this is almost where this is all inevitably led. And I mean, I have conversations with people about regen ag having started very much as a farmer-led movement, but there's increasing momentum for it to usher in a shift in the market itself. And we've already alluded to the relationship that regen ag potentially has alongside organic. And again, some people tell me that actually that share of the market for regen, if that comes in, naturally aligns with that same space within the organic space. So I suppose my question here is, how do we ensure that regenerative agriculturally grown food is simply seen as good food within the marketplace, that we're actually shifting towards a space where we're improving diets, we're improving food quality, we have affordable food? What is your view, having taken all your experience on how we can just ensure that the food that people buy is the best sort of food that they can have available at that time?
Well, I think it's really important we solve that challenge, because at the moment it's very hard if you buy food but you're not super well informed about where it came from to know which label to trust.
Exactly.
There's Red Tractor, there's Leaf, there's the RSPCA labeling, and there's organic. What's the difference between them? How am I supposed to know? Is there greenwash? And then up pops this regen thing. And I don't think there's a food company in the world that isn't wondering how to label products that they buy from Regen Ag, and of course Andy Cato and others already in that space. So I think the way to bring this together, possibly, is to adopt a common measuring system, which we discussed earlier, and link that to some kind of a sustainability score, maybe color-coded or maybe a number. It's a discussion, so that you can navigate these different labels. So if you were to ask me the question, do I think the organic market will disappear? No, I don't think it will. I think it'll remain, because you've got to have dividing lines between food that is produced in a certain way that you trust and food which isn't produced in that way. And I think that organic does a good job with that. Probably can improve, of course, but is basically needed. But I do think that if you think of it as stepping stones towards more sustainable practice, everybody should be on the stairway to heaven, and it shouldn't be polarized. So we shouldn't have battles between the regen people and the organic people. The bigger point is we're all trying to produce healthy food and in harmony with the environment of which we are part. That's what Rudolf Steiner said. You mentioned it was the 100th anniversary of his agriculture lectures. Yeah. He was a visionary, and he basically said that. And he said producing food in an ecological way involves a relationship with nature of which the farmer is part. And we need to move from a chemical approach towards a more biological approach. And then he said even more than that, we need to revitalize the food which has lost its vitality and is affecting public health. And he said that 100 years ago. And although some of his suggestions and indications which form the basis of biodynamic farming are quite challenging to just read straight, I think it's worth a study, as you said earlier.
We always finish the show, Patrick, with the same two questions that I'm going to ask you now. These could be a sentence, it could be a phrase, up to you. But the first one is, if you had a message for the public, any message, what would it be?
I'll just stay with something simple. You are what you eat. Or in the case of livestock products, what you eat, ate. Think about it. Another quote from Fritz Schumacher, the president of the Soil Association, chairman of the National Coal Board, author of Small is Beautiful. He said, we think of the battle with nature, but if we win that battle, we will be on the losing side. How profound is that?
And your message for farmers?
We're all brothers and sisters on the land, and let us rebuild a really strong, cohesive community, recognizing that the people who eat our food are our co-producers in a way. Let's find a way to connect with them, reconnect with them, because many of us have lost that connection.
Well, we will leave it there. I could have kept this interview going for many hours ahead, I think, but we'll probably, I must let you head off to London as well. A huge thank you to my guest today, Patrick Holden, for coming on the show. Thank you, Patrick.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. It's lovely to talk to you.
It'll be my pleasure. Thank you also very much for listening. Next time, we'll be talking insects, and I'll be joined by insect farmer and Nuffield scholar David Taverner. Insects are always a topic in farming that raise interest, so I'm looking forward to that one. But until then, have a great week ahead.